So earlier today, I talked about how inflation can be manipulated by making assumptions on substitution and on hedonics, and on some real life examples that I've witnessed while shopping and living my life over this last year, of how I might be spending 2% more than I did last year, but doing vastly different things, and how it can't be sustained forever. Go watch my last video. I gave some real life examples, and I'm sure you can come up with examples in your life as well. Now, why is inflation underreported? The reason is that the economy is a whole lot less rosy without the manipulation in inflation. I'm looking at the US GDP. This probably looks very foreign to you because it's on a very different scale. It's adjusted for inflation, but with gold as a neutral currency. And looked at this way, GDP today is about the same level as the late 1950s. So think about that. We walked on the moon over here. You are living on half of that, of the time when we walked on the moon. Think about what's happened in between walking on the moon and today, right? The camera I'm using, the computer that I'm viewing this on, none of this existed at the time, right? At the time, it was probably much harder to import a lot of foods that I take for granted nowadays, right? Here's some seaweed that probably has to come from Japan, right? My favorite baking chocolate, if I remember correctly, comes from Canada. And yet we have half of the standard of living of that time, right? Just let that sink in for a second. In 1969, people could actually afford to have 4 or 5 children, and here I am today in 2020, and I've gotten into problems in relationships because, well, my partner wants to have children, and I've broken up with 2 girls over that. Now, I don't know why we still call this a very temporary blip and we're going to have a V-shaped recovery. We actually had a Great Depression. I mean, look at our GDP. It's shrunk from 550 ounces of, billions of grams of gold down to 350. This is on par with a lot of other times when we've had a depression or major recession, right? The Great Stagflation of the 70s, we went, well, okay, the stagflation was bigger, but the Great Depression was a whole lot smaller than the current recession. But for some reason, it's no longer politically correct to call this a depression anymore. So we've been in a recession for more than 50 years now, right? In Japan, they had a lost decade. We might have a lost century. Oh, I think once we lose most of the baby boomers, I think some of this is demographic trends. Okay, well, let's look at the U.S. national debt. Take a guess at how badly we're doing with the real debt during this crisis. We're actually not doing so bad. Now, World War II is right here. This is when we actually had a gold standard, and the U.S. was not the superpower that it was, and it actually had to borrow real money, right? I think the UK was on par with the US in terms of superpower status. By the 70s, we were a superpower. We could borrow fiat currency, and we used that to erase most of our debt. We basically filed bankruptcy, right, in the 70s, right? In the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of capital flight into the U.S. A lot of people were okay with storing their dollars in the U.S. That's what this debt accumulation is. But we filed bankruptcy again. This is again, the U.S. gaining some power again in the 20-teens, right after the global recession. And this is COVID-19 right here, right? Again, we're using our superpower status to, even though we're printing all this currency and borrowing all this money, we're erasing our debts, right? Now, if you're from the United States, how long do you think average incomes have been stagnant in terms of real value. Let's take a look at U.S. wages. Now, despite more people having an education today, we're making a sixth of what we used to make in the 1970s. And we never recovered, the average American never recovered from the 70s stagflation in terms of real income, right? We had a bubble with the dot-com situation. I remember during the dot-com bubble, my mom was working at a Pier 1 Imports, and she was making quite a bit more than the minimum wage at the time. I think the minimum wage was about 4 something, and my mom was making $8 an hour. That's kind of unheard of now, right? You got cities where the minimum wage is $15. I can't imagine anybody making $30 an hour at a Pier 1 Imports, not anytime soon, right? So the dot-com bubble kind of trickled down to everybody else, right? Because you had a spouse who was making out like a bandit during the dot-com bubble. It's going to take a higher wage to entice the other spouse to work, right? Anyways, but more people have an education. How about tuition prices? Where is that? I know I read it earlier. College tuition. It is actually not so bad by historical standards. So when people claim that tuition is a lot higher than it was 100 years ago, what they actually mean is that the return they get on their tuition is a lot lower than it was 100 years ago, right? Let that sink in the next time somebody talks about how high tuition is. And it makes sense, right? In 2020, a lot of people are learning from home, something that was not available in 1900, right? I hate to think how people learned remotely during the 1918 pandemic. But let that sink in. The next time somebody tells you how expensive college tuition is, the real problem is that the return people are getting from it is a lot lower than it was 100 years ago, right? There are a lot of reasons for that. For one thing, they're competing against a lot of other people who are getting a college education, and also the problems that with the how inflation is quoted. So what happens when inflation is underquoted? Let's look at the actual value of the dollar. This is the value of the dollar in terms of gold, except it's on a logarithmic scale, so it doesn't even do it justice. The half-life of the US dollar. So if you were to fit a graph onto that, every 5 or so years, I'll let you read about this, every 5 or so years the dollar is losing half of its value. What's the effect of this? Well, for one thing, if the government is saying the dollar's only going up, losing 2 or 3%, but it's really losing 10 or 20%, and your income doesn't even keep up with either one of those, well, what happens? You're making more money in a dollar scale, but the government doesn't think you are losing value, and so you get pushed into a higher tax bracket, right? The government thinks you're making out like a bandit. You didn't even break even, and you're paying a higher rate of tax, right? Go back to my mom's example. My mom was making $8 an hour. At the time, that was about 2 ounces of silver an hour, right? Nowadays, 2 ounces of silver is over $50. If you make $50 an hour today, which you would have to do something much more skilled than working as a cashier at Pier 1 Imports, you would pay a whole lot more tax than my mom did making $8 an hour at Pier 1 Imports, right? That's called bracket creep, right? The other problem is obviously Social Security, right? The average Social Security check nowadays, I think it was about $1,200 a month. If you adjust that for gold or silver, not only that, but nowadays you get taxed on Social Security despite the fact that you're collecting less than you were only a generation ago, right?